So thanks a lot for joining us, and let's fire away. I didn't quite get the lineup of that right for you there. Priority is a family office serving expats living and working abroad and relocating overseas. What we're looking at today specifically is the EU changes, um, uh, which are affecting short stay rules for people travelling into the EU. And we want to consider the longer term implications for that, uh, for overseas property owners, for businesses, as well as for expats that are living and working abroad. We've got a Twitter space running as well, uh, where we do a bit more discussions and we'll answer questions. If you want to ask a question on the Twitter space, the X-Men space, we could do that, or you can ask a question here either in the comments or hands up. So welcome and thank you for joining us. Oh my God, there's somebody just come into my studio. Um, what can you say? So let's get started and let's consider the latest news for expats living and working abroad around the world. It's tax time for expats. UK expats around the world may have a UK tax return that they need to do. So if you've left the UK in the last year, in the last tax year, or returned to the UK in the last tax year, or if you've got any income that's taxable in the UK, that could be a capital gain from crypto or property sale, or it could be that you've got some other share sales that are going on in the UK. Any sort of capital gain in the UK is always going to be taxable there, needing a return. Or if you're getting property rental income, is also fixed in the UK, so you would need that tax return. So UK expats that are living and working abroad, and in another country with a double taxation treaty between the UK and their country of tax residence, may still need to do a tax return. And sometimes the Inland Revenue will ask you to do a return, even though you've got nothing to declare, so to speak, but you need to do that return if they do ask them. If you get asked to do a return and don't complete it, you're still going to be liable for penalties. So lots of issues there, issues that Proact have got experience on dealing with. So contact us at proactpartnership.com and we'll sort that out for you. Expats that are living around the world, different countries have different tax dates and tax due dates. And generally, the calendar tax year returns are due by the middle of the year, and we've largely wrapped those up. Some countries like Cyprus are a bit later this year, and then those that with a tax year end ending in the spring or the end of June, like Australia or Hong Kong, may have a tax return that still needs to be done now. If you need any help and guidance on that, contact us at proactpartnership.com. What we often get asked questions about in the UK, in Cyprus, is do I need to fill out a tax return? Different countries have different rules. So we've covered previously what the UK rules are. In Cyprus, what are the Cyprus rules for completing a tax return? If you've got personal income below 19,500, then there isn't a requirement to do a tax return. But that's a caveat. That's unless if your income exceeds the 19,500, then yes, you do need to do a tax return. If you've got a worldwide income outside Cyprus as a Cyprus tax resident from dividends, from capital gains, from property rental, then you do need to do that UK tax return, that Cyprus tax return. In Cyprus, if you're self-employed, you always need to do a tax return. If you've got a Cyprus company or you're trading it above a certain volume, um, any business in Cyprus is always an audited tax return that needs to be done, and a self-assessed return as well for any tax liability that needs to be paid during the year. So tax is not paid when you complete a tax return in Cyprus. It's completed as it arises for dividends, health taxes, property rental income, as well as interest for and earnings taxes that may become due. There's also uh, an issue with a new tax that's been introduced on health tax. If you've got any worldwide income, there's not tax at source in Cyprus for this worldwide uh, health tax at 2.65%. You've got that to pay as well. So there's quite a lot of potential liability. And the big thing always that keeps catching expats out is that if you've got real estate, if you've got property in Cyprus and you sell it, or if you die, um, even if you haven't had a requirement to fill a tax return in, they will still ask you then to retrospectively fill out those 5 years worth of returns. So for expats that may at some point relocate overseas, Proact always recommend and advise that you complete a return each year because you're likely going to need it in the event of some dramatic change in your circumstances where you're selling property, relocating with work or family, or on death. For more information guidance, contact us at proactpartnership.com. So another issue that's coming up for expats around Europe at the moment is to do with our topic of today, but it is a separate issue. If you are got an overseas property rental, under changes to tax regulations, um, you now can't necessarily freely rent out that property. Legislation, regulation, whether it's to do with health and safety, consumer protection, or just pure taxation. Now, in many countries around the EU, you're required to have a license before you can rent out holiday lets overseas. That's not necessarily going to be allowable. So in Spain, unless you're a Spanish citizen, you cannot rent holiday let businesses. You may still need a license, and that license might put onerous requirements on you in terms of lifeguards, safety, and insurance liabilities. But it will also, and always will, whenever you get a license for anything, enable the authorities to regulate and ensure that you pay tax. The likes of Airbnb and Booking.com and the international online booking agents for holiday lets as well as longer term lets, they now have to have their landlords registered. The landlord has to have a local license for that property, and that information on those rental income is then shared with the tax authority. So there isn't a discrete tax plan for expats to consider renting out property as a holiday let and discreetly not telling their home country with the tax liability of what that income is. I'm sorry for spluttering today. Don't know where it's come from. We'll manage it for another day. But for more information on registering and getting your property up to date for property let and registration, contact us at proactpartnership.com. Okay, so the main topic of this week's YouTube webinar on the Living and Working Abroad show that we want to look at is the issues around EU residency and short stay rules. We're finding increasingly as expats are trying to travel in and around Europe that they're getting caught up in these issues around short stays, and unless you've got a citizenship of the EU, or a permanent residency, or a visitor's visa, then you are going to get caught up in short stay rules, which are going to be enforced. And it comes from lots of different places as far as the EU is concerned. Um, First of all, let's consider international law and international tax law, as generally prescribed through the OECD, based in Paris. It defines 90 days as a short trip, and therefore it doesn't have a tax implication for anybody on a short holiday, family, or business trip. However, you don't become a tax resident until you've been in the country for more than half of the year. So once you've been in the country more than 183 days, then you become a tax resident, or have a tax resident liability in that country in that year. And in a country like Portugal, for example, if you are in the country for more than 183 days, then you have an obligation to complete a tax return each year, irrespective of your circumstances, just by being in country as a tax resident for more than 183 days. The So the issues that can start to come around that begin to become more and more complex as the system gets applied. Um, Before we go into what the complications are with the short stay rules, I want to step back a bit and talk about the EU Schengen zone and what's that all about. The EU Schengen zone is something that is been developed by the EU to create a visa travel for people from outside the EU, that enables them to travel within the whole of the EU Schengen zone. The EU Schengen zone is mainly EU countries, but it includes other countries as well. So it includes EU members like Norway, and Switzerland. But the Schengen zone doesn't include the UK. The Schengen zone does include Gibraltar by special arrangement, and some of the city states in the EU, like the Vatican City, Monaco, and San Marino. They don't have border controls. They're not technically in the Schengen zone, but there is freedom of movement in and out of those areas. More complicated, especially for overseas property owners, if you've got a holiday villa, the Madeira Islands and Canary Islands, and the Azores, part of the EU because of their sovereign status with Portugal and Spain, and they're also in the Schengen zone. So it's something to bear in mind very, very closely. So if you've got a holiday there, and we talk about Spain or Portugal or Cyprus, it affects Canary Islands and Madeira as well. Technically, Greenland is part of the sovereign state of Denmark. However, it's not in the EU and it's not in the Schengen zone. They opted to come out of both because of their concerns about their fishing rights many years ago. So they did a Brexit before the UK, as a semi-independent country. So that's the extent of the Schengen zone. Now, the people that need a Schengen visa are anybody that's got freedom of movement. Hasn't got visa-free travel into the Schengen zone. So if you're traveling into the greater EU of the Schengen zone, into those 29 countries, then you need a visa unless you have got visa-free travel to the specific country you're traveling into. So if you're a British citizen, you've got visa-free travel to many countries around the world. But if you're coming from India or Philippines, then you can be much more restricted and much more likely to require a Schengen zone for at least one, if not all, of the EU countries within the Schengen zone. But once you've got that Schengen zone visa, it does allow you to visit all of those countries within the Schengen zone. So although you may have to apply to Greece to get a Schengen zone visa to enter into Greece from your home country, once you're in the Schengen zone, you can travel around the EU using that visa for that travel. However, you also need to consider that that Schengen zone visa is now going to be extended, and the Schengen zone visa is got the ability to implement the 90 and 180-day rule. This is where it's enforced at the moment. So if you've got a Schengen visa for traveling around the other EU countries, you've got this 90 and 180-day rule that applies. From 2023, it was initially planned to introduce, although it's been deferred. So the system was up and ready to run from May 23, but they've deferred the date. The EU had deferred the date of implementation into 24 of electronic travel authorities. Electronic travel authorities already exist in many countries around the world, including Canada, USA, and Australia, and they're coming to Europe and the UK. So the UK have got a separate scheme, but the UK have announced that they've got electronic travel authority system that's going to come in as well. That starts from November 23. But for very limited number of countries to start with, and that will be extended and rolled out from November 23 into February 24. There'll be some additional countries added for that. We'll cover that again next time for expats looking to relocate into the UK. Today, we're focusing on the Schengen zone and the short stay rules that apply there. Short stay rules principles are true to any country around the world. From 2024, the EU will produce an electronic travel authority that anybody with visa-free travel into the EU will be required to have. So anybody that doesn't need a Schengen zone visa from 2024 will need electronic travel authority. These have to be applied for online and validated before you travel. And your airline won't let you check in and board without your electronic travel authority, in the same way that they won't let you check in and board without a visa to arrive in the country which you're going to arrive to. So electronic travel authority is a new hurdle for people to achieve. So everybody that travels into the EU Schengen zone will have some form of visa or travel authority. What's the difference between a travel authority and a visa? In practice, not much, okay? Because you can't cross the border into an EU country without a travel authority, even if they don't call it a visa. Generally, it doesn't go into as much detail as you'd imagine that a Schengen visa will, where you need a personal interview, among other things. So it is all done online. So it is lighter, but it's still going to allow you into the country. But what it does as well is it's registering in the system, and it'll enable the EU within the vestiges of the Schengen zone area. It will allow the EU to enforce the 90 and 180-day rules for people travelling into the EU on a electronic travel authority. So if you've got a holiday home and you're used to spending 4, 5, 6 months a year at a time, that's not going to be possible going forward. With the travel authority, you can still go and stay, but you can only stay for 90 days in that 3 months, and that you will be prevented from entering a second time or third time. You can have multiple trips, by the way. It's not just one 90-day trip. So you can have 45 2-day trips. But when you go on to any trip that's going to take you over the 90 days, you should, in theory, be denied entry. But if you overstay, once you're in the country and you overstay your 90 days, you're potentially going to get fined on your way out. And breaching the rules gives them then a reason or an excuse to decline you to get a travel authority to come into the country next time. So again, that's something to bear in mind, that the travel authorities will give the EU Schengen zone area the power to regulate the short stay rules of the Schengen zone visa, even if you don't need a visa to travel into the EU. So let's look at the next stage of it then, particularly from who is not in the Schengen zone at the moment. So Romania, um, Bulgaria, and Cyprus are currently the three EU countries that have applied to join the Schengen zone and not in the Schengen zone area at the moment. Um, Cyprus has met 5 of the 6 criteria towards verifying their Schengen zone status. So it could well be that in 2023 they complete that process and are allowed into the country. Romania, Bulgaria almost were approved in 2022 for this year, like Croatia was. So they could well be all coming in by the end of 2023, in time for the 24 enforcement of electronic travel authorities and the Schengen zone rules. As a next step for Cyprus, on the 25th of July 2023, so last month, they were brought into the EU Schengen information system. So although they're not a full member, and they're not implying that, they're now exchanging information under the criteria of as if they were a EU Schengen zone country. So they may not still require you to have that Schengen zone visa. They may not enforce that they're coming and going in the same way, but they're now part of the information system. And the information system of the Schengen zone, as ever with governments, is they want to protect against crime. They want to check the customs and the borders, that the taxes are being paid. There's no smuggling of goods or services or people across border, and or any other illegal goods. But it also gives them the right to enforce the 90 and 180-day rules and the tax residency rules. Never forget that tax is a criminal offence to break a tax law. And so when they talk about fighting crime across border, that includes tax evasion. Because obviously, if you're a drug smuggling or any form of goods smuggling across border, you are avoiding taxes at some point, and therefore you're committing a criminal offence, just as the same as you would if you're robbing a bank. So tax is important, and it's important to follow the rules and obey the rules. And so Cyprus is now, although they're not formally in the full Schengen zone, are now exchanging that information at the border, and with the people that are coming into the EU through Cyprus. If you're leaving Cyprus and you need a Schengen zone for France or Spain, you will still need to get that visa. But you're already in the system as far as the information system goes by being in Cyprus in the first place. So Cyprus is now one step closer. It's one step away from being in the Schengen zone. The Schengen zone being a complete area where anybody hasn't got visa-free travel into the EU Schengen zone will require a Schengen zone visa to get in and travel. And then the electronic travel authority can be introduced into Europe the same way that it will be in place in the UK and is already in other countries like the USA. And this will allow them to enforce what they apply as their 90 and 180-day rules. What are the implications of that for expats? So let's summarize that. If you're an expat that's living and working abroad, if you've got overseas property or you've got a business and you want to spend more than 90 days in 6 months working abroad, then you will need to have some form of residency permit to be able to stay more than 90 days and 180. So whether you're remote working on a contract in another country, or whether you are uh, want to stay longer in your home, then you will need some form of visa. That might be a 1 year visitor's visa, which may not give you an entitlement to work, but it could, as a visitor, exclude you from a tax residence as well. Um, um, but uh, if you want a permanent residency based upon your home, a property that's owned in that country, or family connections, or um, business connections, then there's additional uh, legislation and regulation that needs to be gone through to get the necessary residency permits that you could do. We spoke last week that Portugal have revised and updated their golden visa scheme. It's very attractive. If you make an investment up to 500,000, you can get an immediate visa with the minimum stay requirements in Portugal, but it allows you to get citizenship in Portugal after 5 years. But that golden visa for Portugal also allows you Schengen zone um, travel without needing a Schengen zone visa. So once you've got a permanent residency or a residency permit in an EU country, that then frees you up in terms of Schengen zone movement. Not necessarily the 90-day in 180 rules, but once you become an EU citizen, and in theory, a permanent resident, because a permanent resident of a country should have the equivalent of citizens' rights. But that doesn't necessarily mean the EU citizens' right freedom of movement. But we will see that in 2024 as they decide on the final format. But what it will mean is that you need that resident permit to be able to have that freedom of movement. Once you've got that freedom of movement all around the EU in the Schengen zone without the short stay restrictions. If you haven't got that residency permit, you cannot stay more than 90 days. If your return ticket doesn't extend to 90 days within that last 6 month period, you're likely to be refused boarding or not be allowed to arrive in the country. If you overstay 90 days, you're likely to be fined when you leave in the country. So it's quite a big restriction. Visitors, 1 year temporary visitors visas are available, or residency permits. So if you've got a business or a property or family interest, now is the time to contact us at proactpartnership.com to look forward into 2023-24 to make sure that your family and your business can continue to enjoy their freedom of movement within the EU with the right level of residency permits. One last thing about the short stay rules to consider is that if you even if you've got a visitor's visa, even if you've got that 12-month visitor's visa, even if you've got a resident permit, if you then stay out of the country for more than 90 days during that time, they're monitoring it because the electronic travel authorities and the Schengen visa gives them access to monitor your movement in and out of the country, so they know where you are and what you're doing. So in theory now going forward as well, if you've got a residency permit because you want to have more stay in your property, you need to look carefully at the type of residency permit that you've got, because if that residency permit could have an exclusion, for example, that says if you spend more than 90 days in one go outside the country, then the residency permit will be revoked. And a residency permit for a homeowner in Cyprus or Portugal in year one can lead to a permanent residency or citizenship after 5 years or more. But if there's a break of more than 90 days at a time, or more than a certain number of days over that 5 years, you could be excluded from being able to upgrade your status to that of permanent resident or citizenship at a later date. So everything's going to be monitored. It's just about making decisions on whether you're a short stay expat from 1 to 5 years, or whether you're considering a longer term business, property, or family move. And Proact have got the experience, the guidance for that, for family and business that want to relocate abroad, and with business or property. We've got no specific questions at the moment. If you want to ask, if you're watching on YouTube and you want to ask a question, we can answer that now. If you want to ask the question on the Twitter X space, then we can do that now. But I've got nothing that's come up from my producer or from the guests at the moment. So what I'm going to do is give it one more summary. The short stay rules will bite. They've got the technology in place already. It's partly conditional on getting Cyprus, Bulgaria, and Romania into the Schengen zone. Cyprus has moved that step closer now. It's completed 5 out of 6 of the requirements for the Schengen zone membership. It's been brought into the information sharing system within the Schengen zone. And so there's every possibility that later in 2023, Bulgaria, Romania, and Cyprus are confirmed into the EU in time for electronic travel authorities in 2024 for anybody on visa-free travel into the EU. In 2023, November as well, UK introduced electronic travel authorities for certain countries that they will choose and decide which they are. So that's to come in as well. And that will could potentially impact people from abroad. Now, at the moment, EU citizens aren't on the list, but they're not exempt as well. So it's named countries, and the initial countries that are going onto the system are countries of concern from a security perspective for the UK. So we'll see about that later. But establishing your residency for business and property, it's important to get that sorted out now for you and for your family, for your children. So contact us at proactpartnership.com and we'll be able to help you with that and give you the guidance that you need when living or working abroad with your overseas property and your business relocation, as well as remote working from a sunnier clime. Thanks a lot for listening, and we'll see you again next time.